She was compelled to wear rags to his grand ball. Then, the Duke demanded a dance only with her. The dress was thrown at her feet, like something a person would toss to a dog. Eleanor Ashworth stood in the narrow hallway outside her stepmother's bedroom and looked down at the heap of gray fabric on the wooden floor. She did not move to pick it up right away. She simply looked at it. The cloth was thin, washed so many times the original color had bled out into something closer to ash. There was a mend at the hem, clumsy stitching done in a slightly different thread that caught the light wrong. Someone had worn this dress hard. Someone had worked in it, and sweat in it, and then discarded it, when it could no longer serve even the most basic purpose. That someone, it turned out, had been the kitchen maid. "You will wear that tomorrow evening," said Lady Cecile from inside the room, not looking up from the mirror where her own reflection held all her attention. "You should be grateful you are coming at all. Most stepmothers would not allow it." Eleanor picked up the dress. She did not say thank you. She did not say anything at all. She had learned, over the years she had lived in this house, that words cost more than they returned. Lady Cecile was not a woman who listened to what was said to her. She listened only to what she wanted to hear, and when Eleanor spoke, whatever she said was somehow twisted by the time it reached Lady Cecile's understanding, coming out the other side as ingratitude, or foolishness, or some new evidence of Eleanor's deficiency of character. So she said nothing. She folded the gray dress over her arm, and walked back down the hall to her own room, which was the smallest room in the house, at the very end of the upper corridor, where the wind came through the gap in the window frame in winter, and the heat collected like a punishment in summer. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed, and held the dress in her lap, and thought about tomorrow. The Duke of Ravensdale was holding a ball. This was not a small thing. Ravensdale Hall was the largest private estate in the county, and the Duke, a man named James Calloway, was the most significant person in 3 counties, on any account you cared to measure by. He was wealthy in the way that old families were wealthy, which meant the money was so deep and so old, it had stopped feeling like money, and had simply become part of the landscape. He was also young, or youngish, just past 30, and unmarried, and those 2 facts had been discussed at every dinner table, in every parlor, and in every carriage, crossing every country road in the region, since he had returned from abroad 8 months ago, and quietly settled back into Ravensdale Hall, as though he had never been away. Lady Cecile had spoken of nothing else for weeks. Her daughters, Philippa and Dorothea, had been prepared for this ball the way a general prepares an army. New gowns had been commissioned in London, and delivered in boxes tied with silk ribbon. Hair appointments had been arranged. Accessories had been acquired, discussed, reconsidered, returned, and reacquired. There had been arguments about which color suited Philippa best, and whether Dorothea's shoulders looked more elegant, in the green or the gold, and Eleanor had listened to all of it from outside doors and at the edges of rooms, quiet and present, and utterly invisible to everyone involved. She had not asked to come. That had been Lady Cecile's idea, and that was what made Eleanor most uneasy. Lady Cecile's generosity was never generosity. It was always something else, dressed up in the clothes of generosity. When she had first told Eleanor, at breakfast, 2 weeks ago, "You shall attend the ball as well," of course, Eleanor had felt a coldness move through her that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. She had looked at her stepmother's face, and seen the small, pleased light in her eyes, that meant a plan was already in motion. And now she understood it. The plan was the dress. Eleanor had been 12 years old when her father, William Ashworth, had died. He had not been a wealthy man, not in the way that Lady Cecile would later claim when she wanted sympathy for her difficult situation. He had been comfortable. There had been enough. There had been a good house, and a warm kitchen, and a father who sat with his daughter after supper and read to her from proper books and taught her that the world was worth paying attention to. Then he was gone. A fever, the doctor said. Swiftly, terribly gone. Lady Cecile had been in the house for only 11 months before he died. She had come into his life at a dinner party hosted by a mutual acquaintance, arrived with her 2 daughters, and her particular talent for appearing to be whatever a person most needed to see, and William Ashworth, who was lonely and kind, and perhaps not as careful as he ought to have been, had believed what he saw. Eleanor had not believed it, even at 12, but 12-year-olds do not get a vote. After the funeral, things changed slowly at first, and then all at once. Eleanor's room moved, her allowance diminished. The small freedoms her father had allowed, the reading, the walking, the occasional visit to the lending library in town, were not taken away directly, but were simply buried under an increasing weight of tasks that needed doing, things that needed managing, errands that only Eleanor could apparently be trusted to run correctly. By the time Eleanor was 17, she was running most of the household in practical terms, while Philippa and Dorothea were given tutors and music lessons and new bonnets. By 19, she had stopped expecting anything to be different. She was 22 now, and she was sitting on her bed holding a kitchen maid's cast-off dress the night before the grandest social event the county had seen in 10 years. She got up and went to the small mirror on the wall, the one with the dark spot in the lower left corner where the silver had gone, and she held the dress up against herself and looked at her own face. She had her father's eyes, dark and steady. She had her mother's cheekbones, or so she had been told, because her mother had died when Eleanor was very young, and she had only a miniature portrait to go by. A small oval painting kept in a box under the bed, the one thing Lady Cecile had never found, or had perhaps found, and decided was not worth taking. She looked at the dress. Then she looked at herself. There was, she decided, no point in weeping about a dress. The dress was gray. The dress was worn. The dress was designed to make her look poor, and out of place, and pitiable at a ball, where everyone else would be in silk and satin. That was the plan. She understood it. Understanding a trap she had found was the first step toward not being entirely destroyed by it. She turned away from the mirror and began thinking practically. She had one thing that Lady Cecile could not take from her, and it was not a possession. It was the way she carried herself. Her father had insisted on it, not in a vain way, not in the way some people insist on good posture as though it were a kind of display, but because he had said, simply, that a person who walks as though they have a right to be wherever they are will generally be treated as though they do. She had absorbed this completely. She had tested it many times in the years since his death, in situations where she had every reason to want to make herself small and invisible, and she had found it to be true. She would walk into the Duke of Ravensdale's ballroom, in a kitchen maid's gray cast-off, with a mend at the hem, and she would walk in as though she had every right in the world to be exactly where she was. She folded the dress neatly and laid it at the end of the bed. Then she went to the window and looked out at the dark garden below and thought about her father and about a dozen other things, and she did not cry, and when she was finished thinking she went to sleep. Morning came gray and cold. Eleanor was up before the household stirred, which was her habit, because the kitchen in the early morning was the only place in the house that was truly hers. She lit the range and put the kettle on, and sat at the kitchen table for a little while in the quiet, before the noise began, with her hands around a cup of tea, and the thin winter light coming through the window above the sink. Mrs. Hallett, the cook, arrived at 6:30 and found Eleanor already there, and said nothing, because Mrs. Hallett was a woman of few words, and those words were almost always about food. She moved around Eleanor without fuss, beginning the business of breakfast, and Eleanor finished her tea and went upstairs to begin the business of the day. There was a great deal of business. Lady Cecile had a list. The list concerned the preparations for this evening, the pressing of Philippa's gown and Dorothea's gown, the polishing of a specific set of shoes, the finding of a lost earring that had been misplaced 3 days ago and which naturally Eleanor was responsible for locating. Eleanor worked through the list without comment. She found the earring in the lining of a reticule that had not been properly checked. She pressed both gowns. She polished the shoes. In the afternoon, while Philippa and Dorothea sat in their mother's room having their hair dressed, Eleanor went back to her own room and dressed herself. There was no one to help with her hair, which was fine. She knew how to do her own hair. She had been doing her own hair since she was a child. She brushed it out and pinned it with care. Not elaborately, but cleanly and well, and the effect was simple and neat, and, if she was honest, not without a certain dignity. She put on the gray dress. It was as bad as she had feared, which meant it was exactly as bad as she had prepared herself for, which meant it was manageable. It hung a little loosely at the shoulders. The mend at the hem showed when she moved, but the fit through the body was not wrong. They were much the same size. She and whatever kitchen maid had owned this before her, and she stood straight and looked at her reflection and thought, "This is what I have, and I will use it well." She had no jewelry. This was also fine. She had her father's steady eyes, and her mother's cheekbones, and the posture her father had taught her. And those were the things that would have to do. The carriage was ordered for 7. By 6:45, Philippa and Dorothea were standing in the entrance hall in their new gowns, which were very fine. A rich rose for Philippa, and the gold that had won the argument for Dorothea. Lady Cecile stood beside them in midnight blue, her neck adorned with the Ashworth pearls, which had belonged to Eleanor's mother. Eleanor came down the stairs. The entrance hall went very quiet for a moment. Then Philippa laughed. It was not a kind laugh. Dorothea put a hand over her mouth, which meant she was either covering a smile or restraining one. Lady Cecile looked at Eleanor from her head to the mend at her hem, and said, with a terrible pleasantness,
"There you are. How
sensible you look." Eleanor said nothing. She walked to the door and waited for the carriage. Ravensdale Hall was 12 miles from Whitmore House, which meant 40 minutes in the carriage on dark country roads. Philippa and Dorothea spent those 40 minutes discussing who might be there and what various people might think of their gowns, and Lady Cecile contributed with observations about the eligible young men who were likely to attend, and Eleanor sat in the corner against the window and watched the dark countryside pass and thought her own thoughts. She was not afraid. That surprised her a little when she noticed it. She had expected to be afraid, but what she felt instead was something quieter and harder than fear, a kind of settled resolution that she recognized from the years of practice. This is happening. This is the situation. What can be done within it? The lights of Ravensdale Hall appeared through the trees when they were still half a mile away, warm and gold against the black winter sky. The carriage joined a line of other carriages on the long drive, moving slowly toward the entrance, and Eleanor could hear the sounds of the gathering even from inside, the low rumble of many voices, the distant thread of music from within. When they stepped out onto the gravel, the cold air hit them all, and for just a moment, Eleanor looked up at the front of the house, at the tall lit windows, and the people moving inside them like figures in a lantern, and she felt something move through her that was not quite hope and not quite sorrow, but was something of both. Then Lady Cecile was moving toward the entrance, and Philippa and Dorothea were with her, and Eleanor followed, 3 steps behind, as she always was. Inside, the heat and the light and the noise of the hall were like stepping into a different world. The entrance was wide enough for a river to run through it. Candles and enormous chandeliers overhead threw light down on perhaps 200 people in various stages of arrival and greeting, the women brilliant in jeweled colors, the men dark and formal beside them. The smell of perfume and warm wax and something floral, hothouse flowers, Eleanor realized, brought in from somewhere, out of season, because no expense was being spared here, filled the air. A servant took their coats. Another directed them toward the ballroom. Lady Cecile swept forward with her daughters, already scanning the crowd for the people she needed to be seen by. Eleanor was simply behind them, which was what Lady Cecile intended, and which Eleanor had expected, and which suited her quite well, because being behind Lady Cecile meant she was not being managed by her. The ballroom was extraordinary. Eleanor had known it would be fine. She had not known it would be like this. The ceiling alone was enough to stop a person still for a moment. Painted in deep blues and gold, figures in classical style moving across it, the whole thing so high that the chandeliers hung like dropped stars between the painted sky and the floor. The floor itself was polished to such a depth it reflected the light back from below, so that everything appeared doubled, the dancers and the candles and the high windows on the far wall, all of it existing twice, above and below. She stood just inside the doorway and looked at it. The social machinery of the room moved all around her. Introductions were happening nearby, the formal small comedy of first encounters, names exchanged and curtsied over. Music, a quartet. She located them in the far left corner, played something bright and controlled beneath the general noise. People laughed. People leaned toward each other. A group of young men near the refreshments table made some collective joke, and the group shifted with the release of it. Eleanor moved along the edge of the room. She was noticed. She had expected to be noticed, or rather to be noticed in a particular way, and she was correct. A woman in amber silk with a very direct gaze looked at her dress with an expression that moved quickly through surprise and settled into what might have been pity, or might have been contempt, or might simply have been the mechanical response of a person categorizing other people by the evidence of their dress. A young woman nearby leaned toward the girl on her arm and whispered something. The girl glanced toward Eleanor and then looked away. Eleanor kept moving. She found a place near the far wall, beneath one of the tall windows, where the curtain made a kind of natural boundary between her and the main press of the room. From here she could see most of the ballroom. She could see her stepmother working the crowd with practiced efficiency, with Philippa and Dorothea in her wake. She could see the dancing, which had begun now, couples moving through the first waltz with varying degrees of grace. She could see the high balcony above the far end of the room, with its carved stone railing, where a few figures stood looking down at the proceedings below. She could see, she realized, almost everything, and she was almost entirely invisible. This was a quality she had developed over years of necessity, this ability to be present in a room in such a way that she registered as part of the background, as furniture, as wall. It was not a comfortable quality to have, but it was a useful one. From here, unobserved, she could simply watch. The evening moved. The music changed. The dancing continued in waves. A set would end. The couples would disperse. New ones would form. The floor would fill again. Eleanor watched it all with the steady, patient attention of someone who has nothing to perform and nowhere to be. She was thinking about her father again. He had loved music, in a mild, unpretentious way, not as a connoisseur, but as a person who found it pleasant, the way he found a good meal pleasant, or a clear sky pleasant, with simple gratitude for its existence. He would have liked this room. He would have stood somewhere much as Eleanor was standing now, she thought, and looked at it with appreciation and without envy, because he had been that kind of man. She missed him with a sharpness that still surprised her, even after 10 years. The first hour passed. No one spoke to her. This was not entirely true. A servant offered her something from a tray, and she accepted a glass of something. Lemonade, she thought, and said thank you, and the servant moved on. But no guest spoke to her, and she spoke to no guest, and the evening moved around her like water moving around a stone. She was not miserable. People assume that invisible means miserable, but Eleanor had spent enough time invisible to know that it could be, in its own way, a kind of freedom. No one was demanding anything of her. No one was watching to see if she would say the wrong thing, or stand in the wrong place, or present the wrong expression. She could simply be in this extraordinary room, and notice what there was to notice, and feel what there was to feel. What she felt, mostly, was a kind of quiet wonder at the room itself, and a quieter, more complicated thing underneath it, which was the consciousness of the gray dress against her skin, and the knowledge of why she was wearing it, and the determination, steady as stone, not to let that fact define her. She was Eleanor Ashworth. She was her father's daughter. She was in a beautiful room, listening to beautiful music, and no dress in the world, however gray, however worn, however deliberately chosen to diminish her, could change those facts. She straightened her back. She kept watching. Above her, on the high balcony, a man had been standing for some time at the carved railing, with a glass in his hand, looking down. Eleanor did not know this, because she was not looking up. But the man on the balcony was looking at her. His name was James Calloway, and he had been standing on that balcony for the better part of an hour, and in all that time he had not seen a single person in the ballroom below who interested him in the least. This was not arrogance. It was, if anything, closer to exhaustion. He had spent 8 months back in England since returning from a 3-year absence, and in those 8 months he had attended more social events than he had attended in the previous 3 years combined, and the events had blurred into a single continuous occasion. The same faces, or faces that might as well have been the same conversations, which were not conversations at all, but were rather performances, carefully rehearsed, in which everyone said the things they were expected to say, and believed they sounded natural saying them. The same assessments, from every direction, the women deciding whether he was worth pursuing, and the men deciding whether he was worth knowing, and all of it transactional, beneath a surface of warmth and good manners. He did not particularly blame people for this. Society ran on transaction. He understood that. He had been born into it, and educated by it, and he knew its rules as thoroughly as he knew anything. But understanding a thing did not mean you were not tired by it. He had organized this ball because it was expected of him. He had been back at Ravensdale Hall for 8 months, which was long enough that an event of this kind was overdue by the reckoning of everyone around him. His steward had mentioned it. His housekeeper had mentioned it. His closest friend, a man named Charles Wentworth, who had the advantage of being both honest and tactful, had mentioned it in a way that managed to be both supportive and firm at once. So he had organized the ball. He had reviewed the guest list. He had confirmed the arrangements. And then, when the evening came and the house filled with 200 people in their best clothes, he had retreated to the balcony above the ballroom, where he could see everything and be seen by no one, and he had watched. He had watched for an hour, and then he had seen her. She was standing near the far wall, below the tall windows, in a dress that was absolutely and unmistakably wrong for the occasion. Not wrong in the way that some people miscalculate fashion, too last season or too bold for their coloring. Wrong in a different and more fundamental way. The dress of someone who either could not afford anything else, or who had been prevented from having anything else. He had noticed her for that reason first. The gray dress in the sea of color was simply visible in the way that a plain thing is visible in an elaborate setting. But then, once he had noticed, he had kept watching, and not because of the dress. It was the way she stood. Most people in a room like this, when they were not actively engaged in conversation or dancing, showed some version of social anxiety in their posture. They would lean slightly toward whoever was nearest, seeking connection. They would look around more than was necessary, checking who was watching them, who was near, whether they were in the right place. Their bodies communicated the low-grade stress of being judged, which in a room like this they always were. This young woman in the gray dress was doing none of that. She was standing with her back straight and her head level, and her gaze moving around the room in a way that was genuinely observational. She was watching things, not watching to be watched. And there was something in her stillness that was different in kind from the stillness of a person who was nervous and hiding it. She was simply there. He found himself wondering who she was. He found himself, a few minutes later, watching with a new sharpness as a woman in amber silk glanced at the gray dress and formed her assessment. He watched the young woman in gray notice this, because she did notice it, and he watched her face do nothing in response. Not a flinch, not a cold expression, just nothing. A continued, patient steadiness, as though she had seen this particular look before many times, and had long since stopped finding it remarkable. That, too, told him something. He watched her for close to another half hour. He watched Lady Cecile. He knew Lady Cecile slightly. She had attended a dinner he had hosted the previous spring. An ambitious and rather exhausting woman, moved through the room with her 2 daughters, who were dressed with considerable care and were executing their social maneuvers with all the subtlety of a military exercise. He watched how Lady Cecile never once looked toward the young woman in gray, or if she did, it was with the deliberately averted quality of someone who wished to make it clear that no connection was claimed. He put these things together. He came down from the balcony. His arrival at floor level caused the predictable redistribution of attention. People turned. Those who had not yet managed to speak to him began their approaches. He responded courteously, because he was always courteous. It was genuinely the path of least resistance, and besides it cost nothing. But he moved through the room with a direction that he made no particular effort to conceal. He crossed the ballroom. Several people watched him cross it and began guessing, with their eyes if not their voices, where he was going. Some of those guesses pointed toward Lady Cecile's daughters, because they were well-dressed and well-positioned, and the most obvious candidates by every conventional measure. Those guesses were wrong. He stopped in front of the young woman in gray. She had not seen him coming, which meant she was genuinely absorbed in watching the room, rather than watching for him specifically. When he stopped in front of her, she looked at him with an expression of plain surprise, unguarded, real, not the performance of surprise that people sometimes offered when they had been expecting exactly the thing they were pretending not to have expected. Up close, her face was. He did not reach for grand descriptions, even privately. It was a face of quality. The eyes were very direct. "I apologize for interrupting your observation of the room," he said. "You seem to have been doing it rather well." She looked at him for a moment. "I did not think I was so obvious," she said. "You were not obvious at all to anyone else," he said. "I was watching from the balcony." Something moved across her face at this. Consideration, perhaps. She was thinking about what that meant, what he had seen, what it revealed. He liked that she did not speak immediately. Most people filled silence immediately, because silence felt dangerous to them. She was apparently not afraid of a brief silence. "You are the Duke of Ravensdale," she said. It was not a question. "I am. And you are?" "Eleanor Ashworth." He had heard the name that evening, early on, when he had been reviewing who was present, and his steward had listed the Ashworth party. He remembered it now in context. The name, and the grey dress, and Lady Cecile's deliberate avoidance, and the expression of the woman in amber silk, all arranged themselves into a clear picture. "Miss Ashworth," he said, "I hope you are enjoying the evening." "I am finding it very interesting," she said. This was precise and careful, and told him nothing definite, which he suspected was intentional. "Good," he said. "I will return for the next waltz, if you will allow me. There are a few introductions I am expected to make first." He watched her face for the reaction to this. She did not beam. She did not look startled. She looked at him steadily and said, "As you wish, Your Grace." He moved on. He made his introductions. He was attentive and pleasant and said all the things that were required of him. And during the time he spent doing these things, he was also conscious, in the background of his awareness, of where Eleanor Ashworth was in the room. He did not look at her directly, but he knew she was near the tall windows. He also knew, with considerable certainty, that Lady Cecile had seen him stop and speak with her stepdaughter, because he had seen, from the edge of his vision, Lady Cecile's body go very still for a moment, in the way a person goes still when they are processing something they did not anticipate. Good. The orchestra finished its current piece. There was the brief settling of the room that preceded each new dance, couples finding each other, positions being taken, the machinery of the thing resetting. James finished the conversation he was in, with a courteous word and a slight bow, and turned around. He walked back to where Eleanor Ashworth was standing. He was aware that this was unusual. He was aware that it was unusual, in a way that was significant, that choosing to return to the same woman twice in one evening, specifically a woman in a worn gray dress, who had been clearly placed in a subordinate position by her own household, was a public statement, whether he meant it as one or not. He did mean it as one. He arrived in front of her and bowed. A full, formal bow, the kind he would give to any woman he was asking to dance. Nothing abbreviated or condescending. The complete thing. "Miss Ashworth," he said, "may I have this waltz? I must tell you in advance that I have decided I would very much like to dance this one only with you." She looked at him again with that steadiness. Then she said, "You are very direct, Your Grace. I find it saves a considerable amount of time." The ghost of something crossed her face. It might have been the beginning of a smile. "Yes," she said, "I believe it does." She took his offered hand. The floor around them shifted and rearranged itself as they moved toward the center of the room, other couples making room, some of them glancing at her dress, and then at the Duke, and then back again, the social arithmetic running visibly through their expressions. He did not look at any of them. He looked at Eleanor Ashworth. The music began. She could dance. He had not been entirely certain she would be able to, not because he doubted her, but because there was no guarantee that she had been given lessons in the years since her father's death. No guarantee she had been permitted the ordinary privileges of a young woman of her class. But she moved with his lead naturally, her feet finding the rhythm without effort, her bearing not stiffened by the awareness of being watched but simply constant, the same as it had been against the wall. "Your stepmother," he said, because he was direct, "did not choose that dress for you." "She offered it," Eleanor said. "I accepted." "You accepted knowing what it was?" "Yes." "Why did you come at all, if the terms were those?" She considered for a moment. He thought she might give him the careful, non-revealing answer, the one that told him nothing. Instead, she said, "Because I had as much right to be here as anyone else. My father's family is an old one. His name was good. The fact that my circumstances are currently—" She paused. "Limited," she chose, "does not change the facts of what I come from." "No," he agreed, "it does not." "You are looking at me," she observed, "as though you are solving something." "I suppose I am," he admitted. "And have you solved it?" He looked at her for a moment longer. The room turned around them, the candles, and the gilt, and 200 people in their best clothes. "I think I have a good idea of the outline," he said. She said nothing, but the ghost of that almost smile was back. The waltz lasted perhaps 4 minutes. In those 4 minutes, the room had been watching, more or less openly, and various things had been calculated and recalculated in various minds. He was aware of this, but not concerned by it. He was thinking about Eleanor Ashworth. He was thinking that he had been in rooms with many people he had found pleasant and clever and good company, and that what he had seen in this woman in 4 minutes of dancing was something that was not any of those things exactly, but was something underneath all of them, something more basic. She was real. In a room where almost nothing was real, she was entirely, stubbornly, immovably real. The music ended. They came to a stop in the middle of the floor. He bowed again. She curtsied. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said. He was going to return to his hostly duties. He was going to circulate and speak to people and fulfill the rest of the evening's obligations. He knew this. He said, "I would like to call on you, Miss Ashworth." She looked at him. Her expression was complicated for the first time. Something moved through it that he could not quite name. Something cautious and hopeful at once, like a window opening in a house that had been shut up for a very long time. "My stepmother," she said carefully, "manages the household arrangements." "I am aware," he said, "that she does." He let that sit there for a moment. Then he added, because he thought she should know, "A call is a public, formal, correct thing, Miss Ashworth. It must be received. There is no good reason for it to be refused, and anyone who tried to refuse it would need to offer the world a very convincing explanation." She was looking at him very directly now. He thought she was reassessing him, not in the way of the ballroom, not the transaction assessment, but something more serious and more personal. "You are offering me a protection," she said. "I am saying I would like to call on you," he said. "What that is, beyond that, is not for me to decide tonight." She held his gaze for another moment. "Very well," she said. "I will look forward to it, Your Grace." He moved on. He had conversations. He spoke to Lord Alderton about a matter of land management. He spoke to Mrs. Pemberton about her charity committee. He ate something at some point and drank something else. He was, to all appearances, a capable and attentive host, fulfilling his duties across a long evening. But a part of his attention, the whole evening, was held by the woman in the gray dress near the tall windows, and twice when he looked across the room, he found that she was already looking in his direction with that steady, direct gaze. The second time it happened, she looked away before he did. He thought that was interesting. On the other side of the room, Lady Cecile had been watching all of this with an expression that was not quite any one thing. She had seen him cross the floor to Eleanor. She had seen the bow. She had watched the waltz from behind the cover of a conversation she was barely present in, nodding at intervals while her actual attention was fixed on her stepdaughter moving across the ballroom floor in a gray kitchen maid's dress in the arms of the most significant man in the county. She was doing the arithmetic. She was doing it fast. She was not, in this particular moment, angry. She was afraid. And fear, in Lady Cecile, had always produced something that looked from the outside very much like calculation. Philippa was at her elbow. "Mama," she breathed. He danced with Eleanor. "I have eyes," Lady Cecile said. "Why would he—" "Be quiet," her mother said, not harshly but very firmly. "Be quiet and smile, and keep smiling, and do not look at Eleanor, and do not look at the Duke for more than 2 seconds at a time, because I need to think." Philippa closed her mouth and kept her smile on and waited. Lady Cecile thought. The carriage ride home was 40 minutes of silence that was somehow louder than noise. Philippa and Dorothea sat across from Eleanor and did not speak to her, which was their usual approach. But there was an additional quality to their silence tonight, a coiled, resentful energy that Eleanor could feel from across the dark interior of the carriage. Lady Cecile sat beside Eleanor and also said nothing for the first 20 minutes. Then she said, in a voice that was entirely without warmth and only barely within the range of what could be called controlled, "You made a spectacle of yourself." Eleanor looked at the dark window. "I was asked to dance," she said. "You should have declined. That would have been rude to our host." A silence. "You will not read anything into it," Lady Cecile said. Eleanor said nothing. "Men like that," her stepmother said, "dance with women for reasons that have nothing to do with serious intention. Do you understand me?" Eleanor continued to look at the dark fields going by outside. The faintest reflection of her own face looked back at her from the glass. Her expression, she noticed, was quite calm. "I understand you perfectly," she said. She did. She understood exactly what Lady Cecile was afraid of, and exactly what she was trying to do, and exactly what the next weeks in Whitmore House were going to look like. But she was also thinking about what the Duke had said, standing in the middle of the ballroom floor after the waltz. "A call is a public, formal, correct thing, Miss Ashworth." She was thinking about that. She sat in the corner of the carriage with her hands folded in her lap and watched the dark countryside, and felt something that she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time, and she was careful with it, because it was fragile, and she knew it, but she also could not quite make herself put it away entirely. She had been told, tonight, by the most important man in 3 counties, that she was worth crossing a ballroom for. She intended to remember that. The letter came on a Wednesday. Eleanor was in the kitchen when it arrived, not because she had been sent there, but because she was often in the kitchen in the mornings, and Mrs. Hallett tolerated her presence, with the wordless acceptance of a woman who had long since decided Eleanor was one of the less troublesome features of her working day. Eleanor was sorting dried herbs into jars, a task she had taken on herself purely because it needed doing, and the rhythm of it was calming, when the sound of the front bell rang through the house. She heard the footsteps of their one remaining housemaid, young Agnes, crossing the hall above. She heard the door. She heard the low exchange of a few words. Then she heard Agnes's footsteps coming quickly toward the kitchen stairs, in a way that was not her usual pace, which meant something had happened. Agnes appeared at the bottom of the stairs, with a sealed letter in her hand, and an expression that suggested she was uncertain who to give it to. The letter was sealed with red wax, and bore a crest that Eleanor did not immediately identify. Agnes held it out to her, because Eleanor was the person in front of her, and Eleanor took it, and read the direction on the front. It was addressed to Lady Cecile Ashworth. And in the bottom left corner, where the sender was indicated in the formal style, were 2 initials and a title that made Eleanor's hands go still for a moment on the paper. J.C. Ravensdale. She set the herbs down very carefully. She carried the letter upstairs. Lady Cecile was at her writing desk when Eleanor knocked and entered, going over some correspondence of her own, with the focused displeasure she brought to any task that reminded her money was a thing that existed, and had limits. She saw the letter in Eleanor's hand, saw the quality of the paper, saw Eleanor's expression, and held out her hand without speaking. Eleanor gave it to her, and stood back. Lady Cecile turned the letter over, and looked at the seal, and was still, for precisely 3 seconds, in a way that was not her usual stillness. Then she broke the seal with a letter knife, and read what was inside. Eleanor watched her eyes move down the page. She watched Lady Cecile's expression do several things in quick succession, none of which fully resolved into anything readable. When she had finished reading, she put the letter down on the desk, and looked at Eleanor, as though Eleanor were a problem that had suddenly become significantly more complex than she had estimated. "He wishes to call," she said. Eleanor said nothing. "On Thursday afternoon," Lady Cecile added, "at 3 o'clock. The room was very quiet. Outside, the wind was doing something to the bare branches of the elm tree in the garden, a low, continuous sound. He addresses the request to you," Eleanor said carefully, "because it is the correct form." "I am aware of what it is," Lady Cecile said. Her voice was flat, which was its danger register. The sharp voice, the raised voice, Eleanor had learned to navigate. The flat voice was the one that meant Lady Cecile was controlling something in herself with effort, which meant she was more unsettled than she wanted to appear. There was another silence. "He cannot be turned away," Eleanor said, even more carefully. "It would need to be explained." "I know. Any explanation would need to account for why a household in good social standing would decline a visit from Eleanor." The voice was still flat. "I am not stupid." "No," Eleanor said. "You are not." Lady Cecile picked up the letter and read it again, which was not the action of someone who needed to read it again for information. She was thinking. Eleanor watched her think, and said nothing, and waited. "Very well," Lady Cecile said at last. She put the letter down. She looked at Eleanor with an expression that Eleanor had seen before. It was the expression Lady Cecile wore when she had been outmaneuvered by circumstances, but had immediately begun identifying the new position and its possibilities. He will be received. Yes, Eleanor said. You will be present. Obviously, since the visit concerns you. Philippa and Dorothea will also be present. Tea will be served in the blue sitting room. She paused. You will wear the blue wool, she said, the one with the white collar. Not, she stopped. Not the gray dress, she had been about to say. Eleanor understood. The calculation had already updated itself. The gray dress had served its purpose at the ball, which was to signal Eleanor's lowly position to everyone present. But the gray dress, in this new situation, had a new implication, and that implication did not serve Lady Cecile's interests. If the Duke visited Whitmore House and saw Eleanor in rags, it would say something about the household's treatment of her, and that was a story that ran in an unpleasant direction. The blue wool, Eleanor said. Yes. She went back downstairs. She stood in the kitchen for a moment, with Mrs. Hallett chopping things at the far end of the table, and she breathed steadily and thought about Thursday at 3 o'clock. She thought about it carefully. She was not without experience of Lady Cecile's maneuvers, and she was aware that the visit being permitted did not mean Lady Cecile had surrendered anything. It meant she had revised her strategy. The visit would be managed. Everything about it would be managed. Where Eleanor sat in relation to Philippa and Dorothea, what was said and by whom, the tea things and the arrangement of the room, and the subtle theater of which daughter seemed most comfortable and accomplished in the company of a distinguished guest. Eleanor understood all of this. She was also 22 years old, and had just been asked, by the Duke of Ravensdale, whether he might call on her. And she was human, and she was her father's daughter, and whatever happened on Thursday, or in the days after Thursday, she could not entirely prevent herself from feeling, quietly and carefully, and with no outward sign, that the morning was slightly more alive than it had been an hour ago. She picked up the dried herbs and went back to sorting them into jars. Thursday came with gray winter sky, and the kind of cold that comes through walls. Eleanor spent the morning at the usual tasks, and spent a portion of the afternoon getting dressed with particular care in the blue wool, which was not a beautiful dress but was a decent one of the few things Lady Cecile had not managed to transfer to her own daughters over the years, because it had been bought specifically for Eleanor, and fitted only her. She pinned her hair, she looked in the mirror, she thought, this is what there is, and it is enough. At 5 minutes to 3, she was in the blue sitting room, where Lady Cecile and Philippa and Dorothea were already arranged with the perfection of a stage setting. The fire was lit, the tea things were ready. The best cushions had made a sudden appearance. Lady Cecile was at the center, with Dorothea slightly to her right and Philippa to her left, and there was one remaining chair that was positioned at a slightly greater distance from the fire than the others, which was where Eleanor was expected to sit. She sat there. At 3 o'clock exactly, the bell rang. James Calloway, Duke of Ravensdale, arrived with no entourage and no ceremony, which surprised her a little. She had half expected some display of position, if only because men of his standing usually found ways to carry their rank visibly with them. Instead, he arrived in a plain dark coat, with one attendant who waited in the hall, and he was shown into the sitting room by Agnes, and he looked around the room once, quickly, with the economy of a person who absorbs a situation fast, before his expression settled into the correct social pleasantness. He greeted Lady Cecile. He was shown to the better chair, the one nearest the fire, which Lady Cecile offered with an amplitude of hospitality that was almost comical, given Eleanor's knowledge of how that hospitality was rationed within the household. He exchanged the expected words with Philippa and Dorothea, who were at their best, attentive and bright, and he was courteous to both of them. Then he looked toward the chair at the slightly greater distance from the fire and said, "Miss Ashworth." "Your Grace," Eleanor said. He looked at her with an expression that the room could not have read as anything other than perfectly polite, and that Eleanor, looking directly back at him, could read with considerably more specificity. He had also, in that single quick look around the room, absorbed the arrangement of the chairs. He knew exactly where she had been put. Lady Cecile was asking him about his plans for the estate, which was a perfectly correct question, and one that could produce 20 minutes of acceptable conversation. He answered it well. He was clearly comfortable talking about Ravensdale, not in a boastful way, but with the straightforward ease of a person who knows a subject thoroughly and has no need to perform knowledge of it. Eleanor listened. He spoke about the land management changes he was making, about his plans for the home farm, about a restoration project for the east wing of the hall. At an appropriate pause, Lady Cecile smoothly redirected the conversation to Dorothea's talent for watercolor, which was her current project, and Dorothea produced a small portfolio from somewhere as though this had been entirely spontaneous, which it very clearly had not. He looked at the watercolors. He said kind and accurate things about them, because he was evidently not a man who gave empty praise, but was capable of identifying what was genuinely good in something, and commenting on that specifically, rather than offering the general approval that meant nothing. Dorothea was pleased. Lady Cecile was pleased. Eleanor watched. He turned toward her. This had the quality of a decision, rather than a drift. "And you, Miss Ashworth?" he said. "Do you paint?" "I used to," she said. "My father taught me a little, when I was young. I have not had much time for it recently." Lady Cecile's expression did not change. It did not need to. Eleanor knew she had said the wrong thing. The right thing, but the wrong thing for this particular performance. The right thing was honest. The wrong thing was that honest, in this context, pointed at Lady Cecile. "What did you occupy yourself with this morning?" he asked, conversationally. Eleanor looked at him. She looked at Lady Cecile. She said, pleasantly, "The usual household things." "Of course," he said. He asked her about books next, which was either coincidence or an act of considerable social consideration, because books were something she could speak about genuinely. She had continued to read, somehow, through all the years of diminishment, because books could be borrowed from the lending library on the occasions she was sent to town, and because Lady Cecile had not thought to prohibit reading specifically, perhaps because she did not recognize it as the source of sustenance it was. Eleanor spoke about what she had been reading. He listened in the way that good conversationalists listen, with his actual attention rather than the performance of it. Tea was poured. Conversation continued. The hour passed. When he rose to leave, he made his formal farewells to Lady Cecile, and then to Philippa and Dorothea, and then to Eleanor. And his farewell to Eleanor was no different in form from his farewell to either of the sisters. Perfectly correct. Nothing that could be pointed to. Nothing that could be complained of. Except that as he said goodbye to her, very briefly, for perhaps half a second, his eyes held hers with an expression that was not part of the social farewell at all. It said, "I see what is happening here." She held his gaze for the same half-second. She gave him nothing back in expression, because she was in a room with Lady Cecile, and this was not the moment. But she thought, "Yes, I know you do." He left. The sitting room without him in it felt smaller than it had when he arrived, which was a strange thing, given that he had not been loud or large or in any way physically dominant. He had simply been a person of considerable substance, and the room registered his absence. Lady Cecile was very still for a moment. Then she turned to Eleanor and said, in her flat voice, "You will not encourage this." "I was asked questions," Eleanor said. "I answered them." "You will not," Lady Cecile repeated, "encourage this." A pause. "Whatever he imagines he is doing, it is a diversion. He will find a suitable match among his own kind, as men like him always do. In the meantime, you are not to give him the impression that you are available for his amusement." Eleanor looked at her stepmother for a long moment. She thought about many things in that moment, about her father's house and her father's study, and the miniature of her mother in the box under her bed. She thought about 8 years of small erosions, of thin wool in winter, and borrowed books and tasks that never ended. She thought about a gray dress thrown at her feet. She thought about James Calloway looking at her across the ballroom from his balcony, and then choosing to cross the floor to reach her, and she thought about what it meant that the most powerful man in the county had looked at her, in all her deliberate diminishment, and seen something worth walking toward. "Yes, Lady Cecile," she said. She kept her expression perfectly calm. She kept her voice perfectly level. And she went upstairs to her room and sat on the edge of her narrow bed and looked at the patch of gray winter sky through the window and thought about Thursday, the quality of his attention, and the half-second of directness in his eyes before he left. She thought about those things for quite a long time. Outside, the elm tree moved in the wind, and the cold came through the gap in the window frame, and she sat there in her blue wool dress and her steady, patient hope, and she let herself think, perhaps, Perhaps. That night, after supper, she took the small oval portrait of her mother out from the box under the bed and held it in her hands. She did not say anything to it. She just looked at it for a while. Then she put it carefully back. He came back the following week. This was not, Eleanor understood, entirely ordinary. A formal call, extended after a first meeting at a social occasion, was standard. A second call in the same fortnight was something else. It meant intention. It communicated intention to anyone paying attention, and several people were paying attention, because in a county of this size, the Duke's movements were observed with the same diligence that people in other circumstances might bring to the weather. The letter arrived on Monday, addressed again to Lady Cecile, requesting the second visit for the following Thursday. Lady Cecile received it in the same flat-voiced stillness as the first, and gave the same tightly controlled consent. Eleanor spent those days between the letters and the visit, doing what she always did: the work of the house, the errands, the quiet management of things that would otherwise go unmanaged, but with a new layer underneath it, a low, continuous thread of awareness that she tried to keep quiet and practical, and refused to let become anything more than it was. She was also, in this same period, subjected to something new from Lady Cecile that was subtle enough to be difficult to name, but impossible to miss, if you were Eleanor, and had been reading Lady Cecile's methods for years. Lady Cecile began, in those intervening days, to talk about the Duke. Not to Eleanor. She never addressed it to Eleanor directly. She said things at dinner, as observations, as general conversation. She mentioned, one evening, that she had heard from Mrs. Pemberton that the Duke was widely understood to have a particular type in mind for his eventual marriage, and that type was— Lady Cecile paused here, as though the word were simply the accurate one. Refined, accomplished, of a certain social polish. She did not look at Eleanor as she said this. She mentioned, another evening, that a cousin of hers had known a woman who had been briefly considered by a man of similar standing, and that nothing had come of it, because men of that class had social obligations that overrode personal inclination, however genuine the inclination might briefly be. She mentioned, in passing, that the household budget was very strained this quarter, and that new curtains for the blue sitting room were unfortunately out of the question. None of these things were connected, and none of them were addressed to Eleanor, and all of them were precisely aimed. Eleanor ate her dinner, and said little. She had been listening to Lady Cecile's methods for 8 years. She was not immune to them. No one was entirely immune to being told, repeatedly, in the language of calm observation, that they were not enough, and would never be enough. The erosion was real. But she had developed, over those 8 years, a kind of interior architecture, a place inside herself where these things could not reach. She went there when she needed to, and stayed there until the words were past, and then she came back out, and continued. Thursday arrived. He arrived exactly on time again, which she was beginning to understand was a characteristic rather than a coincidence. He was a man who was precise about time, in the way that people are precise about it when they consider other people's time to be worth respecting. The sitting room arrangement was the same as before, Lady Cecile and the sisters positioned, Eleanor in the chair at the greater distance from the fire, the tea things, the social performance. But something was different today, and Eleanor felt it almost immediately. He was not playing by the same rules as before. He greeted Lady Cecile and was perfectly courteous, but the questions he asked this time were more specific. He asked about the estate management, which, as he clearly knew, and as Eleanor could see him registering, meant he was asking Lady Cecile to account for how Whitmore House was run. He asked about the household's acreage. He asked, with the perfect blandness of someone who knows exactly what they are asking, whether the household kept many staff. Lady Cecile answered everything smoothly. She was good at this. But Eleanor watched her stepmother's eyes, and in those eyes was the same careful calculation she had seen since the first letter arrived, the permanent arithmetic of a woman who was trying to determine what this man wanted, and whether she could manage it to her own advantage. He turned to Eleanor partway through. He had done this earlier in the visit this time. "Miss Ashworth," he said, "I owe you an apology." Lady Cecile's expression did not move. "I referred last week," he continued, "to having watched from the balcony at the ball. I have since thought that might have been an odd thing to say to someone you have just met, and I wanted to correct any impression of strangeness it might have left." "It left no odd impression," Eleanor said. "It was an honest thing to say." You value honesty. Considerably. As do I, he said. It is a comfort when two people agree on the same foundation. Lady Cecile moved the conversation to Philippa's recent progress with the pianoforte. Eleanor said nothing during this portion and let it happen around her, because Philippa's pianoforte was real. She was genuinely good, better than Eleanor had been at the same age, and because she understood that the visit would not consist entirely of him talking to her. That was not how these things worked. She was patient, but he returned to her again, and again after that. He asked her about the town. Had she been recently? Was she familiar with the lending library? He asked this in a way that suggested he had noticed her mention of borrowed books the previous week and had filed it. She said she went to town when she was able, and that the lending library was one of her preferred stops. I have a library at Ravensdale that is somewhat more extensive, he said. You would be welcome to make use of it, if you found occasion to visit. Lady Cecile's hand tightened slightly around her teacup. That is very generous, Eleanor said. It is also practical, he said. Libraries exist to be used. Mine is used primarily by me, which means most of it sits idle, which seems wasteful. She almost smiled at this. She did not quite, because the room contained Lady Cecile, but it was close. He stayed the full hour again. When he left, the same ritual of farewells, the same correct and equal courtesy distributed across all four women, and the same half-second of held directness in his eyes when he reached Eleanor. After he was gone, Lady Cecile sat in the sitting room for a moment, without speaking. Dorothea murmured something to Philippa. Eleanor sat quietly and waited.
He is very attentive to you, Lady Cecile said at last.
He is very attentive to everyone, Eleanor said. Do not be naive. Eleanor looked at her stepmother. She said carefully, I am the least naive person in this room. This was too direct. She knew it as she said it. Lady Cecile's eyes sharpened. Philippa and Dorothea both went carefully still, because they had spent enough years in this household to know what certain tonal shifts meant. But Lady Cecile did not respond immediately. She looked at Eleanor for a long moment, and Eleanor looked back, and the room held the silence between them. You may go, Lady Cecile said finally. Eleanor went. That evening, alone in her room, she thought about what was happening. She was trying to be precise about it, because she was a precise person when she could be, because precision was a form of honesty, and she valued both. She was trying not to let the things she felt become larger or more definite than the evidence warranted. What the evidence said was this. A man of considerable standing had met her at a ball and had been interested enough in her to return to her twice. He had visited twice, both times with apparent genuine interest in speaking specifically to her. He had observed, with intelligence and without display, the conditions of her life in this house. He had mentioned his library. What the evidence did not yet say was what any of this meant in terms of what would happen next. She was 22 years old and had lived 8 years in a house where her interests were managed by someone else's calculation, and she was not a person who was going to construct a future on incomplete evidence. She was going to be careful. She was going to be honest with herself. She was also going to allow herself, sitting here in the dim lamplight of her small room with the wind at the window, to feel something that she had not felt in a very long time. Something like being seen. Not admired, not desired in the way of a passing distraction, but genuinely seen, as a person who was thinking specific things and had come from specific circumstances and was worth specific, particular attention. Her father had made her feel that. No one since had come close. She sat with this for a while. Then she banked the small fire and got into bed, and for the first time in a long time she fell asleep, not to silence, but to a quiet that had something in it, other than nothing. He wrote to her. Not to Lady Cecile, to her. The letter arrived 10 days after the second visit, and it was addressed in his hand to Miss Eleanor Ashworth, which was not the correct channel for correspondence between them at this stage, and which he knew perfectly well. He had done this deliberately. He had created a situation. If the letter was intercepted by Lady Cecile, he would have to know, because he had arranged for a second copy to be delivered through a different means. A note through the lending library, where the librarian, a Mrs. Croft who had known Eleanor since she was a child coming in with her father, received it and set it aside for her with the discretion of a woman who understood more than she said. Eleanor received both the original and the library note within an hour of each other, which told her exactly what he had done and why. The letter itself was not long. It did not say very much, in one sense. In another sense, it said a great deal. It asked how she was, genuinely, not in the social formality way. It referred to a book she had mentioned, one she had read and spoken about during the second visit, and said that he had taken it down from his shelf after she mentioned it and had read the passage she described, and that she had been right about it. It said that he hoped the library at Ravensdale would be open to her soon. It said, in the last line, that he was aware his letters should perhaps be going through her guardian's hands, and that he had not done so in this case, because he wanted her to read this one without editorial assistance. Eleanor read this several times. Without editorial assistance. He knew. He knew about the management. He had seen it in the sitting room, in the chair arrangement, in Lady Cecile's careful steerage of the conversation, in the way Eleanor was present in the room, and yet positioned at its margin. He had seen it, and he had decided, rather than pretending he had not, to acknowledge it directly, privately, between them. She sat with the letter for a long time. Then she wrote back. She wrote to him at Ravensdale Hall, through the lending library, through Mrs. Croft, who accepted the sealed letter and asked no questions. Her letter was not long either. She thanked him for writing. She said she had read the passage he mentioned. She said she agreed with his interpretation of it and would be interested, someday, to discuss it further in person. She said she was well, and that Whitmore House was much as it always was. She said, at the end, that she was grateful for the consideration that had led to the library arrangement. She did not say anything more than that. She was precise. She was careful. She was honest in what she wrote, and careful about what she did not yet have grounds to write. But she sent the letter, and Mrs. Croft received it, and whatever happened next, the correspondence existed. She and the Duke of Ravensdale were writing to each other. Lady Cecile did not know. Eleanor went home from the library that afternoon with the borrowed novel she had gone in for, and she walked back through the cold winter street with her basket on her arm and her face, to anyone who looked, entirely ordinary, and inside her something was moving that she had kept still for too long. 3 more letters crossed between them through the lending library in the following weeks, and then Lady Cecile found out. Eleanor had not been careless. She had been careful. She collected and sent letters through Mrs. Croft, who was discreet, and who had made clear through her manner, if not her words, that she found the situation between the gray-dressed girl and the Duke of Ravensdale to be something she approved of in principle. Eleanor had given no outward sign of the correspondence. She had made no mistakes that she could identify. What happened was this. Agnes, the housemaid, let something slip. Not maliciously. Agnes was not a malicious person. She was 17, and easily startled, and not particularly skilled at holding things back, when Lady Cecile put questions to her directly. She had seen Eleanor coming in from town one afternoon, with a letter tucked carefully into her basket under the novel, and she had thought nothing of it, and when Lady Cecile, the following morning, asked Agnes in that particular flat, careful voice whether she had noticed Miss Eleanor spending an unusual amount of time at the lending library recently, Agnes said yes, she believed so, and mentioned the letter. Eleanor found out about this the same afternoon, from Agnes herself, who appeared at the door of the linen room, where Eleanor was working with red eyes, and the expression of someone who has just understood the weight of a mistake they cannot take back. "Miss Ashworth," she said, in a very small voice, "I'm sorry. I think I said something I should not have." Eleanor looked at her. She put down the linen. "Tell me what you said," she said, and her voice was steady, because the steadiness was necessary right now. Agnes was close to tears, and tears would not help either of them. Agnes told her. Eleanor sent her away gently, and stood in the linen room alone for a few minutes, recalculating. She had known this was a risk. She had known, in the practical part of her, that a secret in Whitmore House had a limited lifespan, because Lady Cecile ran the household as a system of observation, and she was good at it. Eleanor had simply hoped for a little more time. More time for what? She was not certain. More time to understand what the letters were building toward. More time to feel, in private, the small warmth of being in correspondence with someone who wrote to her as though her thoughts were worth receiving. She went downstairs. Lady Cecile was in the parlor. She was sitting in the chair nearest the window, which was not her usual chair. and she had a letter opener in her hand that she was turning slowly, which meant she had been sitting here thinking and had picked up the letter opener because it was on the table and her hand wanted something to do. Eleanor came in and closed the door. "Sit down," Lady Cecile said. Eleanor sat. Lady Cecile looked at her for a moment. The flat voice, when it came, was so controlled it was almost gentle, which was the most dangerous version. "You have been corresponding with the Duke." "Yes," Eleanor said. "Without telling me." "Yes. Behind my back, secretly. Using the lending library as a means to deceive me." Eleanor said, "The letters are private correspondence. The arrangement was made to ensure they remained so." Lady Cecile's eyes were very still. "This is my house," she said. "You are in my care. You have no private correspondence that I am not entitled to know about." Eleanor looked at her. She said, "I am 22 years old. You are an unmarried young woman under my roof, which does not make my letters your property." A silence fell that was quite different from the silences that usually fell in this room. This one had weight to it, the weight of something that had been held in restraint for a long time, and was now very close to the surface. Lady Cecile set the letter opener down carefully on the table. "I have given you a home," she said, "for 8 years. "You have," Eleanor said. "I have clothed and fed you. You have. Whatever the conditions of that arrangement have been, I have housed you and provided for you when I had no obligation to do so beyond the legal minimum." Eleanor looked at her steadily. She did not agree or disagree with this characterization of events, because arguing it would not help anything. "You have done all of those things," she said. "And now," Lady Cecile said, very quietly, "you are conducting a private correspondence with a man who is, I will tell you plainly, never going to offer you anything except a very temporary and very damaging kind of attention. And when that attention is done, and it will be done, you will have compromised your reputation in a way that cannot be undone, and you will still be here, in this house, and you will have nothing." Eleanor looked at her. She had heard this argument before, in various forms. She had heard it at the ball, in the carriage, in the sitting room after both visits. She had been hearing it for years, in fact, in the general form. The form that said, "You are not enough, you will not get out, this is where you will stay, do not expect anything." She had heard it so many times that she had learned to sit with it and let it pass, the way you learn to sit with cold when you cannot have warmth. But she was tired today. She was tired in a way she did not usually let herself be. "You sent me to the ball in a kitchen maid's dress," Eleanor said. Lady Cecile's expression did not change. "You planned it specifically," Eleanor said. "You offered to let me come, and then you chose that dress, and you let me walk into the Duke of Ravensdale's ballroom, looking like I had been dressed by someone who wanted everyone to see that I was diminished." Her voice was steady. She kept it steady. "I understood that. I put the dress on and I went, because I had as much right to be there as anyone else, and no dress was going to change that." Lady Cecile was looking at her with an expression Eleanor could not quite read. "And then," Eleanor said, "he crossed the ballroom." A silence. "Not to Philippa," Eleanor said. "Not to Dorothea. To me, in my gray dress. And whatever you believe about his intentions, that is what happened, and it happened without any effort on my part. And it happened because he looked at me and saw something worth walking toward." She stopped. She steadied herself again. "I have lived in this house for 8 years, and in that time, I have been given the minimum the law required, and sometimes a little less than that. I have not complained. I have not created difficulties. I have done the work and kept my head down and asked very little." "Eleanor." "I am not finished," Eleanor said, quietly. Lady Cecile stopped. "I am going to continue the correspondence," Eleanor said. "I am going to be careful and correct, and I am going to do nothing that is not proper. But I am going to correspond with him, and I will do so through the library, because that is the arrangement he made, and I will not dismantle it." She looked at her stepmother. "If you object to this, you are welcome to write to him and say so, and to explain your objection, and he will receive that letter, and he will read it, and then whatever he decides to do about it will be visible to anyone who cares to observe his actions." Lady Cecile's face did something complicated. "You would let that happen," she said. "I would not prevent it," Eleanor said. You are my guardian, as you have said. You may write whatever you choose. The room was very quiet. Lady Cecile picked up the letter opener again, and then put it down again. She stood up, and went to the window, and stood with her back to Eleanor for a long moment, looking out at the garden, where the bare branches of the elm were doing their winter thing. When she turned around, something in her face had settled into a different configuration. Not warmth, not kindness, but the calculation had reached a new conclusion, and the new conclusion looked different from the old one. You will not meet him outside this house, she said. You will not go to Ravensdale Hall alone. If he visits here, in this sitting room, in the correct form. Eleanor waited. The correspondence, Lady Cecile said carefully, can continue, through whatever arrangement he has made. Eleanor looked at her. She understood what had happened. Lady Cecile had decided that stopping the correspondence was more dangerous than permitting it, because stopping it meant confronting him, and confronting him meant making an enemy of him, and making an enemy of the Duke of Ravensdale was a calculation that did not work in Lady Cecile's favor by any arithmetic she could construct. Very well, Eleanor said. This does not mean I approve, Lady Cecile said. I understand, Eleanor said. She got up. She went to the door. She stopped with her hand on the door frame, and she said, without turning around, "Thank you." She did not mean it sarcastically. She meant it precisely. It was a transaction, and they both knew it was a transaction, and she was acknowledging the transaction, and that was all. She went back to the linen room, and stood there for a moment looking at the stacked shelves. Then she went to find Agnes, who was in the scullery, and she said, "It is all right, Agnes. Don't worry yourself about it." Agnes looked at her with red-rimmed eyes. Did she? "It is fine," Eleanor said. "Everything is fine." She went back to the linen. That evening she wrote her next letter to James Calloway at Ravensdale Hall, and she sent it the following morning through the lending library, through Mrs. Croft, who accepted it with her usual quiet discretion. In the letter she said that she was looking forward, very much, to the conversation about the book she had mentioned. She said that spring seemed to be arriving, and that the elm tree in the garden had begun to show the first faint signs of new leaves. She said she hoped he was well. She said, at the end, that she had been thinking about what he had written in his first letter, about wanting her to read it without editorial assistance, and that she had appreciated it more than she knew how to say properly. She sealed the letter and gave it to Agnes to take to the library, and Agnes took it with the solemn care of someone undertaking a mission of importance, which Eleanor found, quietly, touching. She went back to the window and looked at the elm tree. There were new leaves, very small, very green, the particular green of early spring that is almost startling after the long grayness of winter. She looked at them for a while. Then she went to do the next thing that needed doing, because that was how she had always survived, one next thing at a time, patient and steady, until the things around her changed, which they always eventually did. The elm was leafing. Spring was coming. Something else was coming too, and she felt it in the patient, hopeful place inside her that Lady Cecile had never managed to reach. The fourth letter from James Calloway was longer than the others. It arrived at the lending library on a Tuesday in early March, when the days were still cold, but the light had shifted. That particular shift that happens before spring is visible, but after something in the air has changed its mind about winter. Eleanor collected it in the early afternoon, on the way back from an errand in town, tucking it under her arm inside the cover of the borrowed book she had returned, and she did not open it until she was home, and in her room, with the door properly closed. He wrote clearly. She had noticed this in his previous letters. He wrote the way he spoke, without ornamentation, and what he said was what he meant, which was a quality she found deeply restful, in a way she had not expected. Ornamentation was exhausting. You had to read through it to find the actual meaning, like translating a language. His letters required no translation. This one was long, because he had more to say. He said that he had been thinking about the situation at Whitmore House. He said this plainly, without apologizing for saying it, and without softening it into anything less direct. He said he was not going to pretend he had not observed it clearly during his 2 visits, and that the observation had stayed with him, and he had thought about it carefully. He said he wished to ask her something, and that he would ask it directly, because he thought she preferred that, and he was asking through a letter, rather than in person, so that she would have time to think before responding, because the question deserved thought. Eleanor read the next paragraph twice. He said that he had come to the conclusion, over the weeks since the ball and the visits and the correspondence, that she was a person he wished to know better, and that the constraints of her current situation made knowing her better more difficult than it should be, and that he had an idea about how to address those constraints if she was willing to hear it. He said that he was not going to ask her to make any decision or commitment at this stage. He said this firmly, as though he understood she might be frightened of where the letter was going, and wanted to forestall that particular anxiety. He said, "What I am proposing is simply that you come to Ravensdale." What he meant was, come for a visit, a proper, formal, social visit, with Mrs. Croft or some other appropriate companion, to see the library, to have time away from Whitmore House, to simply be somewhere else for a few hours. He would arrange it so that the invitation was extended publicly and formally, and in such a manner that Lady Cecile could not refuse it without visible reason. He said, at the very end of the letter, that he was aware this was forward of him, and that he would not press the matter if she was uncomfortable. He said that he had simply reached the point where he wanted to give her a space that was not managed. Eleanor sat with the letter in her lap for a long time. She thought about what it would mean to say yes. She thought about what it would mean to say no. She thought about Lady Cecile, who had grudgingly permitted the correspondence, and who would receive an invitation of this kind with the same combination of calculation and flat-voiced resentment she brought to every development in this situation. She thought about the visits to the sitting room, the chair at the greater distance from the fire, the endless careful positioning. Then she picked up her pen and wrote back. She said yes. She said it in 3 short, clear sentences. She appreciated the care he had taken in how he framed the invitation. She would be very glad to visit the library. She was certain Mrs. Croft would be willing to accompany her. She sealed the letter and sent it. She spent the next 2 days in a state that she refused to call nervousness, but which resembled it closely enough that she slept badly and paid insufficient attention to the herbs she was supposed to be sorting into their jars. The formal invitation arrived at Whitmore House on a Friday. It was addressed to Lady Cecile, as all correct things were, and it invited Miss Eleanor Ashworth to visit Ravensdale Hall the following Thursday afternoon for the purposes of consulting the library, with Mrs. Croft of the Ashford Lending Library as companion. Lady Cecile read it. She showed nothing on her face. She set it on the desk. She said, to the empty room, because Eleanor was not present for this part, something under her breath that Eleanor never heard, and which was perhaps as well. Then she wrote her acceptance, because there was nothing else she could do. On Thursday, Eleanor dressed with care in the blue wool again, because it was the best she had, and she walked to the lending library to collect Mrs. Croft, who was waiting with her coat already on, and her hat pinned, and an expression of carefully contained anticipation. "Ready, Miss Ashworth?" she said. "Yes," Eleanor said. The Duke had sent a carriage, which was waiting outside. It was not a showy carriage, not the kind designed to make an impression, but it was fine and warm, and the horses were excellent, and the drive to Ravensdale Hall took 15 minutes on the main road. The house, in the afternoon light of early spring, was different from how it had appeared at night. At night it had been blazing and almost theatrical. In daylight it was simply enormous and old and quietly confident in its own substance, the way very old things sometimes are. The stone had weathered to a color that was almost gold in the right light. The gardens were showing the first green. The drive was lined with old chestnuts that were just beginning to bud. Eleanor looked at it through the carriage window. She was not intimidated. She had examined herself for intimidation on the way here, and had found something else. A kind of reverence for the age of the place, for the fact that it had been standing, and would go on standing, long beyond any one person's account of it. That was not intimidating. That was simply large. They were met at the door by a housekeeper, a Mrs. Finch, who was brisk and kind, and showed them to the library personally, which told Eleanor something about the instructions that had been given regarding this particular visit. James Calloway was in the library. He rose when they entered. He greeted Mrs. Croft with genuine courtesy. Eleanor noticed that he was as attentive to her as to Eleanor herself, which was not something everyone thought to do with companions, and he showed her to a comfortable chair by the fire with a table of refreshments nearby. Then he turned to Eleanor. He looked at her for a moment, in the way that people look at each other when they have been corresponding and are now recalibrating the version of the person they have constructed in their minds against the person who is actually standing in front of them. "Miss Ashworth," he said. "Your Grace," she said. "Welcome to the library." She looked around it. She had imagined it from his descriptions in the letters, but she had not imagined it quite correctly. It was not magnificent in a showy way. It was magnificent in the way of something that had accumulated over generations. Wall after wall of books in cases that reached the ceiling. A rolling ladder on a brass rail. A pair of reading tables with good lamps. A fireplace at the far end that was burning well. There were books open on the reading table nearest the fire, which told her this was not a room maintained for appearance, but one that was actively used. She walked to the nearest shelf and looked at the spines. "You may take anything," he said from behind her. "Whatever you want to read, you are welcome to borrow it." She pulled out a volume and looked at the title page. It was a history of the region, printed in 1771. She put it back and moved along the shelf. "Thank you for making this possible," she said, not turning around. "It was not difficult to make possible," he said. "It only required a letter. Several letters," she said. "True." She pulled out another book. She was aware of him standing a few feet behind her, and was also aware, with the quiet peripheral attention she brought to his presence in rooms, that he was not crowding her or hovering. He was simply there, at an appropriate distance, letting her move through the room at her own pace. She found a shelf of natural history and stopped. She spent the next hour in the Ravensdale Library, and it was the best hour she had spent in 8 years. She moved from shelf to shelf with a liberty she had not felt since her father's study, choosing things to examine and things to set aside, occasionally asking him a question when she wanted context for something, and he answered without lecture or performance, simply giving the information she had asked for and letting it stand. Mrs. Croft sat by her fire and drank her tea and radiated discreet contentment. Eventually, Eleanor sat down at one of the reading tables and opened the book on natural history she had selected, and he sat at the other reading table with something of his own, and for a while they simply read in the same room, in a silence that was not uncomfortable. This, she thought, was extraordinary. Not the library, though the library was extraordinary. The silence. The easy, unpressured quality of it. The fact that she was in a room with someone who was not managing her, not observing her for weakness, not positioning her, not calculating her. He was simply in the same room, reading. She looked up at one point and found that he was already looking at her over his book. He did not look away immediately, which she found she liked. "What?" she said. "I was thinking," he said, "that you are very much at home in a library." "I have not had a library to be at home in, for some time," she said. "You have one now," he said simply. She looked at him. She said, "You are very direct." "You have said that before," he said. "It bears repeating," she said. He almost smiled. It was nearly the same thing she had almost done in the sitting room during his visits. Not quite, but close enough that she recognized it as the same quality, the same instinct held in check by the same habit of restraint. They were, she thought, somewhat alike in certain ways, more alike than was probably useful, given that alike people tended to understand each other's defenses. "Miss Ashworth," he said. He set his book down and looked at her directly, the same directness as in the ballroom, as in the sitting room, as in the letters. "I would like to tell you something." She put her own book down and waited. He said, "When I came down from the balcony at the ball, I did not have a plan. I want to be clear about that, because I think you have a tendency to assume that people have plans, and in this case you should know that I did not. I saw someone who was real, in a room where very little was real, and I walked toward her before I had thought about whether it was wise." Eleanor looked at him steadily. "Since then," he said, "I have thought about whether it was wise." "And?" "It was," he said simply. "You are the most honest person I have met in a very long time. The honesty is not a performance. It is simply what you are, and I have spent a considerable amount of my adult life in rooms with people who perform honesty without being it, and I find I do not want to be in those rooms anymore." Eleanor said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "I do not know what is going to happen." "No," he said, "neither do I." "I am careful about things I do not know," she said. So am I, he said. That is not the same as refusing to move toward them. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about her father. She thought about 8 years of careful, patient surviving. She thought about the gray dress, and the crossed ballroom, and the half-second of held directness in his eyes when he bowed goodbye, and the letters through the library, and this room, and the silence they had just shared. She said, "No, it is not the same." Mrs. Croft made a small, satisfied noise from her corner by the fire. Neither Eleanor nor James looked at her, but Eleanor felt, very clearly and very quietly, that something had just opened that had been closed for a long time, and that whatever was on the other side of it was worth walking toward. She picked up her book. He picked up his. They read, together, in the afternoon light of the Ravensdale library, while the fire burned and Mrs. Croft drank her tea, and the spring moved forward outside the tall windows. 3 weeks after the library visit, the second ball of the season was announced. This one was not at Ravensdale. It was at the house of Lord Alderton, a property some miles to the north, a family of good standing whose annual spring ball was the second event of the social calendar. The invitation arrived at Whitmore House in the usual form, extended to Lady Cecile and her daughters, and Eleanor's name was included on it, because Eleanor had been included in Whitmore House's social obligations since the Duke's interest had made her exclusion socially complicated. Lady Cecile said nothing about this that Eleanor could hear, but the situation in the house had shifted in a way Eleanor felt clearly. Even if it was difficult to name exactly, she was still given work. She still inhabited the edges of rooms and the chair at the greater distance from the fire. But the particular active quality of the diminishment had changed. It was less energetic, somehow, less interested. Lady Cecile was still calculating. She was always calculating. But the calculation had moved into a different mode. Eleanor thought, she has accepted that something is happening. She has not accepted it with grace, but she has accepted it. She did not expect grace. She would take the acceptance. The ball at Alderton House was, in every external way, smaller and less dazzling than the Duke's own occasion at Ravensdale. But it was still fine. The rooms were lit, the music was good. The guests were the usual county population, dressed in their usual social clothes. Eleanor wore the blue wool, which by now she understood was simply the fact of the matter, and did not permit herself to feel sorry about. She arrived with Lady Cecile and the sisters. She was 3 steps behind, which was usual. She entered the rooms, which were warm and crowded, and she found a position near the edge of things, which was usual. What was not usual was that she had been inside the room for perhaps 20 minutes, when she became aware of a change in the social texture near her, a kind of directed movement through the crowd, and she looked up, and James Calloway was making his way toward her. He was not crossing the room at Ravensdale this time, with 200 people watching. He was moving through a smaller, less structured gathering, but the directness of his course was the same, and the people nearest to him were registering it in the same way, a small adjustment of awareness, a turning of heads, the social calculation running visibly through the assembled faces. He reached her. "Miss Ashworth," he said. "Your Grace," she said. "Will you walk with me?" he said. "The Aldertons have a gallery on the first floor that is worth seeing, and it is somewhat less crowded than this room." Eleanor looked at him. She looked around at the room, at Lady Cecile, who was 20 feet away, and had seen this. She could see Lady Cecile's profile go very still, and then she looked back at him. "Yes," she said. "I would like that." They walked through the gathering, and up the main staircase to the gallery, which was indeed quieter and cooler, and which contained a long line of portraits and landscapes hung on dark walls with lamps below them. A few other guests were here, moving slowly along the paintings, and their presence meant the situation was correctly public, without being the spectacle of the ballroom below. He walked beside her along the gallery. He said, as they stopped before a landscape, "I have been to see your father's solicitor." She looked at him. "I hope you will not think it forward of me," he said, "though I suspect you will think it forward, and you will be correct. I wanted to understand your legal situation, the terms of your father's will, and your current position in the household." Eleanor was very still. "I am not going to tell you what he told me," James said, "because it is your business, and you know it better than I ever could from a solicitor's account. What I will tell you is that I wanted to understand it, and I now do." "And," she said, And it is a clearer picture than Lady Cecile would prefer anyone to have, he said. A silence. She had known, in a general way, the terms of her father's will. She knew that he had left Whitmore House to Lady Cecile for her lifetime, with certain provisions for Eleanor that Lady Cecile had found various ways to minimize without technically violating. She had never had the money to challenge those minimizations legally, and the solicitor had been Lady Cecile's solicitor first. "You spoke to him," she said slowly, "as yourself." "Yes," he said. "So he told you the truth." "He told me a great deal more than he would have told you if you had walked in alone," James said. "That is a separate injustice. But yes." She looked at the landscape in front of her without really seeing it. She was doing the calculation. What this meant, what he was telling her, what the fact of him having done this said about the direction of his thinking. "You are investigating my circumstances," she said. "I am trying to understand them," he said. "There is a difference. I am not doing it to collect information. I am doing it because—" He stopped. He was choosing his words. "Because I would not ask someone to enter a new situation without first understanding the situation they are in." She turned and looked at him directly. He looked back. "Ask," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "You will think it is too soon." "Tell me what you want to say," she said, "and let me decide what I think about it." He said, "I would like to offer you a way out of Whitmore House. Not because I pity you. You should know that pity is not any part of what I feel when I look at you. But because I have found, in the month since the ball, that I do not want to be in any room for long if you are not in it, and I would like that to continue indefinitely, if you will allow it." Eleanor listened to this. She heard every word of it. She said, "Are you asking me to marry you?" "Yes," he said, "I am." She was quiet for a moment. She was not going to say yes immediately. He knew that. She could see he knew it. He was not watching her with the expression of a man expecting an immediate answer. He was watching her with the patience that she had come to recognize as characteristic of him. The patience that was not passivity, but was something more active. A willingness to let things take the time they needed. "I need to think," she said. "Of course," he said. "I will not think for very long," she said. "I do not need a great deal of time, but I need some." "Take whatever you need," he said. She nodded. She turned back to the landscape and looked at it, really looked at it this time. A river scene, willows, the light on water. And she breathed steadily, and let herself be in this room, in this moment, with this question sitting between them. She thought about her father. She thought about what he would have said, in the study, in the evenings, over the books. She thought about the way he had always told her the world was worth paying attention to, because good things happened in it, alongside the hard things, and the trick was to keep your eyes open so you did not miss the good things when they arrived. She thought about a gray dress and a crossed ballroom. She thought about letters through a library and a silence shared over books, and a man who had gone to a solicitor to understand her position before he asked her to change it. She looked at the painting. Then she turned to him. "I do not need very much time at all," she said. He looked at her with that steady, direct attention. She said, "Yes." Lady Cecile received the news the following morning. James had insisted on coming to Whitmore House in person to speak to her. Eleanor had asked him to allow her to be present, and he had agreed, and so they arrived together in the sitting room. The formal blue sitting room, with its careful fire and its arranged chairs, and Eleanor sat in the chair nearest the fire this time, because she was done with the chair at the greater distance. Lady Cecile looked at them both. She looked at the arrangement of the chairs. She looked at Eleanor's face. She was very still for a long moment. James told her, in correct and considerate terms, of his intention. He was not unkind in how he said it. He was not triumphant. He simply said it, clearly and directly, because that was how he said things. Lady Cecile listened to all of it. Then she said, "I see." There was a silence. "I wish you joy," she said, in a voice that was not warm, but was at least controlled. Eleanor looked at her stepmother, across the familiar room, the room where she had served tea and received visitors, and sat in the wrong chair for years. She looked at Lady Cecile's face, the calculation still running, adjusting even now to the new landscape, finding the new position and its possibilities. And she felt something that surprised her. Not anger, not satisfaction. The cold kind that people sometimes feel when they have been vindicated against someone who wronged them. Mostly she felt tired of it, tired of the calculation, tired of the management. She looked at Lady Cecile and she felt, simply, that she was done with this room and this arrangement, and that she could leave it without needing to be fierce about leaving. She had what she needed. She could simply go. "Thank you," she said to Lady Cecile. She meant it precisely, as she had meant it before, acknowledging a transaction, giving the thing its correct name. Lady Cecile said nothing. Eleanor and James left. Outside on the gravel drive, in the bright spring air, Eleanor stopped for a moment and tilted her face up to the sky. The elm tree above the garden wall was in full leaf now, soft and green against the blue. The light was clean. James stood beside her. "Are you all right?" he said. She thought about it honestly. "Yes," she said. I am quite all right." She looked at the elm tree for another moment. Then she turned to him, and she smiled, not the almost smile, not the ghost of one, but a real smile, the kind that had been kept waiting in that interior place, where Lady Cecile's calculations could not reach, the place her father had built in her, the place that had been keeping things safe until it was time for them. "Let us go," she said. He offered her his arm. She took it. They walked down the drive together in the spring morning, and the elm tree moved in the light wind above the wall. And the world, which had been very small for a very long time, opened up in front of her like a page that had been turned. The months between the proposal and the wedding were busy in the way that such months are always busy, full of arrangements and meetings, and the particular kind of social machinery that accompanies an event of any significance in county life. Eleanor had never managed anything at this scale before, but she had managed Whitmore House through 8 years of diminished resources and difficult conditions, and she found that the larger scale was not, in itself, the difficulty. It was simply more of the same practical intelligence applied to different problems with better tools. She moved to Ravensdale Hall in the weeks leading up to the wedding, staying as a guest of James's cousin, a woman named Catherine Harlow, who was warm and practical, and who made Eleanor feel, for the first time in 8 years, that she was someone whose company was genuinely wanted. Catherine was married to a man who managed a neighboring estate, and she came to Ravensdale for the pre-wedding period with her 2 children, who were young enough to be entirely uninterested in the social theater of the situation, and interested primarily in whether Eleanor would play card games with them in the evenings, which she would and did. "You are very good with them," Catherine said one evening when the children had been collected for bed, and the 2 women were sitting by the fire in the library. "I like them," Eleanor said simply. "They say what they mean." Catherine looked at her with a clear, sympathetic gaze. "James told me a little," she said, "about your circumstances. I hope you don't mind." "He has good judgment about who to tell things to," Eleanor said. "He does," Catherine agreed. "He told me because he was worried about you, in the early months. He did not know if you were all right, in that house, and he could not always tell from the letters." Eleanor looked at the fire. "I was all right," she said. "He thought you would say that. Because it is true." "Yes," Catherine said. "But also because you are the kind of person who says it regardless." Eleanor considered this. "That is fair," she said. "It will be different here," Catherine said. She was matter-of-fact about it, not sentimental, which Eleanor found she preferred. "You will have your own rooms and your own arrangements, and nobody will put you in the wrong chair." A pause. "Or give you a kitchen maid's dress to wear to a ball." Eleanor looked at her. "He told me that too," Catherine said. "I hope you will forgive him." "He was right to tell you," Eleanor said. "It should be told. Things like that should not be kept quiet, because it is polite to keep them quiet." Catherine nodded. "I like you," she said simply. "I like you too," Eleanor said. The days at Ravensdale in this period were different from any days Eleanor had known in the previous 8 years. She was not unoccupied. There were decisions to be made about the wedding, about the house, about various arrangements that needed her input. But the work was work she was choosing to do, and that was not a small distinction. The difference between a task chosen and a task imposed was something only people who had experienced both could fully measure. She walked in the grounds in the mornings. She read in the library in the afternoons. She spent evenings with Catherine, and sometimes with James, in a comfortable mixture of conversation and silence. and she was slowly, carefully, with all the caution of someone who has learned not to trust anything too quickly, beginning to understand what it felt like to be somewhere she belonged. The night before the wedding, she sat alone in the guest room that would soon be her room. The rooms had already been prepared. She had chosen the arrangement of them. This was the first space that had ever been arranged according to her own decisions, and she took out the small oval portrait from its box and held it in her hands. Her mother's face looked back at her from the miniature, small and painted and still. She sat with it for a long time. She thought about what she would say, if she could say anything. She thought about all the ordinary things, about what her mother might have been like, what she might have said about this day, about James, about the library, and the letters, and the gray dress, and the crossed ballroom floor. She thought about whether her mother would have been proud of her. She thought about her father. She thought about him very specifically, the way he had looked in the evenings in the study, settled into his chair with a book and a comfortable lamp, and no performance at all. The way he had looked up when she came in, always with an expression of genuine pleasure at the interruption, the expression of someone who found the world more interesting with her in it. She thought, I am going somewhere tomorrow where someone looks at me like that. She was careful not to let herself cry, not because crying was wrong, but because she was tired, and crying when you are tired tends to go further than you intend. She sat with the portrait, and she breathed steadily, and she let herself feel everything that was there to feel, quietly and completely, and then she put the portrait carefully back in its box. She would take it with her tomorrow. It would come to Ravensdale. It would go on the dressing table in the room that was going to be hers. Her mother would be there. She went to bed and slept well, which surprised her a little. She had expected to lie awake with the weight of the day ahead, but she fell asleep quickly and slept without interruption. And when she woke in the morning, the light was coming through the curtains in clean long stripes across the floor. She lay still for a moment and listened. The house was beginning to wake around her. She could hear the distant sounds of it, the movement of servants going about the morning's work, the birds outside, the wind. She listened to all of it. Then she got up. She had chosen an ivory dress for the wedding, not white, which was not required by convention, but ivory, a warm and quiet color that suited her in a way she could see in the mirror and did not need anyone to tell her. It was well made and fitted correctly, and it moved well, and there was nothing about it that was designed to diminish her or place her or position her in anyone else's arrangement. It was simply a good dress that she had chosen herself. Catherine came to help her dress, bringing with her the kind of calm and practical cheerfulness that made the process feel easy rather than overwhelming. The children had been forbidden to enter the room, which produced a prolonged low-grade noise of protest from outside the door. They want to see the dress, Catherine said. Let them in, Eleanor said. The children came in and examined the dress with the seriousness of small people conducting an important inspection, and pronounced it satisfactory. The church was the old stone one at the edge of the village, which had been standing for 300 years and showed no signs of stopping. The morning was clear, and the air was cold, in the particular sharp way of late spring mornings, and the chestnut trees along the drive were in full bloom, the white candles of the flowers bright against the sky. Eleanor walked into the church on the arm of Charles Wentworth, James's oldest friend, who had agreed to stand in the position of her escort because she had no family of her own to fill the role. He was a quiet man with a kind expression, and he said nothing to her as they walked, which was exactly what she wanted, not because she needed silence, but because she could feel that he understood this was a significant moment and was letting her have it fully. She saw James at the front of the church. He was standing with his back to her, which meant she had a moment before he knew she was there, and in that moment, she looked at him steadily and thought, this is the man who crossed a ballroom. This is the man who wrote to me without editorial assistance. This is the man who went to a solicitor and came to the library and asked me to marry him with the same directness he brought to everything else. He turned around. He looked at her. His expression was not the polished social expression of a man performing the role of groom. It was real. She had learned to read the difference. The real things came from somewhere behind the face, not from the face itself, and you felt them rather than just saw them. She felt this one. She walked toward him, and he watched her come, and when she reached him he said, very quietly, only for her. You look as though you belong here. I know, she said. I was just thinking the same thing. The ceremony was not long. She had asked for a simple one, and it was simple, and the words of it were the correct words that had been said in this stone church, and 1,000 churches like it across centuries, and she said them clearly and without hesitation, and he said them the same way. When it was done, and they walked back down the aisle together, she was aware of the faces on either side, the county people, the neighbors, the various figures from the social world of the last months, all of them watching. Some of them had been at the first ball. Some of them had seen the gray dress and drawn their conclusions, and were now revising those conclusions with considerable speed. She did not look at any of them. She looked forward. Outside the church, in the clear morning air with the chestnuts in bloom and the birds doing their business in the trees, she stopped for a moment and simply stood still. James stood beside her. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed. He offered her his arm. She took it. They walked to the carriage that was waiting on the road, and the door was opened for them, and she stepped in, and the door closed behind them, and the horses moved. She looked out the window as the church fell behind them, and then the village, and then the fields opened out on either side of the road in the spring morning, green and wide and full of light. She had spent 8 years in a house where she was managed and diminished and positioned in the wrong chair and given gray dresses to wear to balls, and none of that had broken her, because she was her father's daughter, and he had taught her that a person who walks as though they have a right to be wherever they are will generally be treated as though they do. He had not told her what to do when someone crossed a ballroom to reach you. He had not told her about that part, because perhaps it was not something you could tell a person in advance. Perhaps it was something you had to wait for, and keep yourself whole enough to receive, and then walk toward when it came. She had waited. She had kept herself whole. She had walked toward it. She turned from the window and looked at James Calloway, who was already looking at her, which she was beginning to accept as simply one of the facts of her life going forward. "The library," she said. "Yes," he said. "I have a very long list of things I want to read," she said. He looked at her with the expression that was almost a smile. "I would be surprised if you did not," he said. She looked back out the window at the spring fields. She thought about the elm tree at Whitmore House, which would be in full leaf now, without her there to see it, and she thought about Mrs. Croft at the lending library, and Agnes with her red-rimmed eyes, and Mrs. Hallett at the kitchen range in the early mornings, and all the small particular kindnesses that had lived inside the difficult years. And she thought about what was in front of her now, the library, and the mornings, and the rooms arranged as she had chosen them, and a man beside her who had decided, without a plan, that she was worth crossing a room for. The world was wide. She let it be wide.